Okay, Chem 1110 students, we are going to finish Chapter 7. We are going to be talking about the current or most recent bonding theory, which is the hybridization of orbitals. When we looked at the valence bond theory in part 2, we didn't do any examples where the bonds observed just could not result from the simple orbital overlap of atomic orbitals. And when that occurred, in the example I'm going to give you is CO2, and the scientists at the time said, well, maybe we can just mix the atomic orbitals, we can hybridize them and get an orbital that would describe the angle that we're seeing. And you need to remember that at that time, orbitals were just equations that were described by the Schrodinger equation that described the shape of the orbitals where the electrons were. So this is simply a matter of adding two, I shouldn't say simple, but very complicated equations. And what I'm talking about is, if you look at the molecule, which is CO2, we know it's linear, we know its bond angle is 180 degrees. But if you were trying to look at it as simply an overlap of the two oxygens with the carbon atomic orbital, we see that carbon has 3p orbitals. That's where the valence electrons are, and the s orbital, of course, but that bond angle would have to be 90 degrees, so it didn't explain the 180 degrees that we saw. So we're going to talk about hybridizing atomic orbitals, and I'm going to use barium dichloride. The Lewis theory and Vesper theory predict that the barium dichloride bond angle will be 180 degrees. There are two electron domains and a linear molecular geometry. The ground state beryllium atom has a spin paired pair of electrons in the 2s. So therefore, there's no unpaired electrons to form a bond. And so hybridization theory said that what had to happen was the beryllium had to go into an excited state and unpair those electrons so that bonds could be formed. So one of the electrons is promoted to the 2p orbital, and that's why the Be has a little star by it, is because it's in an excited state. And now the chlorine can overlap with that 2s from the beryllium and the 2p, and you can get two bonds, but they would not be equivalent. And so we know that experimentally those bonds are identical in length and in strength, and so therefore we get down to the idea that we have to mix those orbitals so that we get two orbitals. We call them sp, because it is the 2s and one of the 2p's that are mixed. And so if we just use our electron diagram, we see we take that 2s and the 2p, we combine that mathematically, and we get two equivalent orbitals that we're going to call sp orbitals. And then we can see in the little diagram below, the sps have this funny shape, but they can overlap with the p's in the chlorine to form the barium dichloride. Okay, so that chlorine does have a singly occupied 3p orbital, and so that's how we actually form the molecule. All right, so to determine the number and the type of hybrid orbitals necessary in BF3. So another example, the Lewis structure is a trigonal planar for boron trifluoride. So we need to figure out the number of hybrid orbitals that are necessary to be able to explain this. So we count the number of electron domains on that central atom. We know it was a trigonal planar, so there were 3. And so we need 3 hybrid orbitals. And this is what makes hybridization really simple to do the problems. So we draw the ground state orbital diagram for that central atom, and then we maximize the number of unpaired valence electrons by promoting them. So in this case, boron has to have 3 electrons, but in single orbitals. Then we're going to combine those so we get the right number of hybrid orbitals. We need to make 3 bonds. So we take 3 electrons, the s and 2 p's, and we make 3 equivalent orbitals that are called sp2. We call them sp2 because they were made from an s and 2 p's. And so it's really easy to keep track. And so when we do that, we can have a symmetrical BF3 molecule. Here's another example, and this is for methane. So we look at the Lewis structure we get 4 electron domains and 4 hybrid orbitals are required. We look at carbon. Carbon has 2 electrons in the 2s, 2 single electrons in the 2p. We need to spread them out so that we get 4 individual orbitals that have 1 electron each. And so we take the s and the 3 p's to get 4 equivalent orbitals. We need to use 4 orbitals, and so we get 4 sp3 orbitals. They are called sp3 because it came from 1 s and 3 p's. It gives 4 orbitals where 1 electron can sit. All right, another example then is going to be PCl5. If you remember, we looked at this one before when we talked about polarities. And in this case, we need 5 electron domains, if we just go back here, because we need to make 5 bonds. This is a trigonal bipyramidal. And so we need 5 electron domains, we need 5 hybrid orbitals. We look at that electron configuration and for phosphorus, and we see there's a bonded pair or a spin pair in the 3s and then 3 individual electrons in the 3p's. But we need to remember that being in the 3rd row, phosphorus does have 3d orbitals. So if we need to make 5 equivalent orbitals, we use our s, our 3 p's, and one of our d's, or you can see it as this promotion. So we make 5 equivalent orbitals that are called sp3d. So it's really pretty straightforward to figure out what the hybridized orbitals are going to be called, because you need to take as many orbitals as you need to get. All right, so here's some pictures of what we think these orbitals look like. It's just sort of a for instance, not exactly something you need to memorize. Okay, if you have a double bonds, you get a little bit different picture. So we're going to look at ethylene. Ethylene, it has 2 carbon centers, if you will, and each one has 3 electron domains. The one where it's bonded to the other carbon, and then 2 where it's bonded to the hydrogens. So we expect we would need sp2 hybridization. All right, if we look at the carbon, we see it has a pair of electrons in the 2s and 2 single electrons in the 2p. And we can promote that so that we get 3 single electrons, in the 2s and the 2p's, but they're not equivalent. So we only need 3 electron domains. So we take the first 3, the 2s and 2 of the p's, we hybridize them, and we get an sp2, and we are left with a p orbital that has 1 electron in it. So the thing that we need to remember is that a single electron is what each atom needs, because a bond is sharing 2 electrons. And in this case, we have an unhybridized 2p orbital. And this is what's going to give us our double bond. And so what we're going to talk about is those single bonds that are going to be made with the sp2 are called sigma bonds, sigma single. So the shared electron density is going to lie along the internuclear axis. So our 2 carbons are bonded to each other through an sp2, and we see this overlap, we get a sigma bond. And you'll note that we have an extra p that is standing upright around each carbon atom. And so those are the unhybridized p orbitals which can share an electron and form a bond. So we've got 5 sigma bonds, and that's where the carbon is bonded to the other carbon, and then each carbon is bonded to a hydrogen. And in order to get that pi bond, or the bond between the 2 hybridized or unhybridized p orbitals, is they sort of overlap in a sideways fashion above and below the nuclei, and that's where it takes both lobes. Both lobes make 1 p orbital. Okay, then we can look at acetylene. Acetylene has a triple bond, and we see if we look at one of these carbons, we only need 2 bonding orbitals, 1 to go to the carbon, 1 to go to the hydrogen. So this would be sp hybridization. And when we do that, we promote our electrons, so we have individual electrons in the atomic orbitals, and we then are going to hybridize just the s and the p, so we get 2 equivalent orbitals to make for the carbon to make the bond to another carbon and to a hydrogen. And then we have 2 unhybridized p orbitals that each have 1 electron in them, and these are what are going to form our triple bond, because each carbon, remember, has these. And so we get a sigma bond formed with the sp orbital that's between the carbons. And then we're going to get 2 pi bonds because we have 2 unhybridized p orbitals. Remember, the top and the bottom are 1 orbital, the in and the out are another orbital. So you get overlap of 2 p's up and down, and if you will, horizontally. You need 2 lobes for it to be a pi orbital. Okay, so we do have to realize that some molecules are best described if you kind of combine your models, your theories. And so we're going to look at benzene, and we know from previous work that benzene has 2 resonance structures, and that's just moving the electrons around. And so there are pi bonds, because double bonds are pi bonds. And what we are saying is that, those pi bonds don't actually switch back and forth, but they are delocalized over the entire molecule. And so the way we think about this is they are not alternating double bonds, but they're more like 1.5 bonds all the way around. And so you get an electron cloud sort of above and below the benzene ring. And that's the end of chapter 7.